Pyongyang has been under UN sanctions since 2006. In 2016, its GDP grew by 3.9%. Between October last year and May this year, it generated $270 million by exporting banned commodities. So how does a country which faces ever-increasing sanctions grow its economy? According to the UN Security Council's panel of experts, it's through evasion techniques that are increasing in scale, scope, and sophistication. Pyongyang's agents are highly experienced at moving money, people, and goods, including arms, across borders. And the UN says they often use foreign citizens and front companies to avoid detection. Here are some examples of how North Korea skirts sanctions. In 2015, Bangladesh seized $1.4 million worth of gold bars and jewellery in the hand luggage of a North Korean diplomat stationed in Dhaka. The diplomat had an invoice for the goods from Dubai and he collected them from Singapore. The UN said he made similar trips to Singapore for 15 months, suggesting he was a regular courier smuggling contraband. Under 2016 sanctions, UN member states had to deregister ships with links to the regime, and they weren't allowed to fly the flag of another nation. But in February this year, there were still North Korean vessels sailing under the flag of the Republic of Tanzania. In August, the UN placed its 7th round of sanctions on North Korea, banning the trade of coal, iron ore, lead ore, and seafood. The US and Japan have also imposed secondary sanctions this month on companies and individuals with ties to the regime. But if Pyongyang has been able to evade sanctions for more than a decade, what difference will new measures make? Natalie Pohonen, The Newsmakers.
So, can Pyongyang be contained? To discuss this, let's go to our panel of guests. From Washington, Bruce Klinger. He's a former CIA Deputy Division Chief for Korea. Also in Washington, Georgetown professor Matthew Kroenig, who's an expert on North Korea and is writing a book on US nuclear strategy. And from London, Keith Bennett. He's a political analyst who's traveled to North Korea dozens of times over the past 3 decades. Gentlemen, good to have you on the program. Bruce Klinger, let's begin with you and with the news that we heard overnight. North Korea firing a missile over Japan. Is it as scary as it seems?
Well, it's certainly provocative. It's yet another violation of UN Security Council resolutions, and it's even more brazen than before. North Korea had refrained from flying over Japan since 2009. All the recent missile tests had been in a very high trajectory so as to not fly over Japan. Recently, Pyongyang, though, had vowed or threatened to fly missiles over Japan, but towards Guam. This missile instead went in more of a northeasterly direction towards Alaska, though far short of Alaska.
Keith Bennett, are these the actions of a rational or irrational actor?
Well, I think that if you try and look at things from the North Korean point of view, which is something that people rarely seem to do, and whether you agree with them or not, it's very hard to understand them if you don't try and look at it from their point of view. I think it's quite a rational response. It's certainly, from the Western point of view and from the Japanese point of view, upping the ante, but I think the North Koreans would see it as a response both to the UN Security Council resolution that was recently passed, as well as the ongoing Ulchi Freedom Guardian war exercises that are taking place in and around South Korea at the moment, which the North Koreans regard as a rehearsal for an invasion of their own country. So from that point of view, I think their response is quite understandable.
Matthew Kroenig, is it understandable to you?
Well, I think there's no doubt about who is responsible for this recent round of provocations. The North Koreans are in violation of multiple UN Security Council resolutions with this illegal nuclear and missile program. The U.S. alliance with Japan and South Korea have been in place for decades. A legal arrangement. The countries can conduct military exercises if they'd like. It's really this North Korea nuclear and missile program that's the problem, and the rest of the world sees that. The United States is increasingly getting cooperation from the Chinese and others to try to put real pressure on North Korea and address this threat.
Matthew, as has been said by you and Bruce, the fact that the North Koreans have been violating Security Council resolution after Security Council resolution, and they've been doing all of this while under sanctions, not only by the United States, but by many others. We had a little report showing how they evade sanctions, how they allow their economy to grow, how they spur things in their own country in their own way, and they're smarter than maybe some people give them credit for. With all of that in mind, and given that we are where we are right now, have the sanctions failed?
I think North Korea has been effective in evading sanctions so far, but this is a cat and mouse game, and the United States and its partners have some other cards to play as well. Most importantly is secondary sanctions. So instead of going directly against the North Koreans, the Trump administration has begun passing sanctions against the Chinese firms, the Russian firms doing business with North Korea. And there's a lot of room to ramp up these secondary sanctions. So once these go into place, then these Chinese and Russian and other firms are going to have a difficult choice. Would you prefer to trade with North Korea, or would you prefer to have access to the U.S. market, the U.S. financial system? And most of those firms are going to choose to cut off trade with North Korea, and that will start to put some real economic pressure on Pyongyang.
What's the likelihood, Bruce, and I'll bring you in here, what's the likelihood of that backfiring where secondary sanctions against the likes of the Chinese or the Russians, especially when it comes to the Chinese, means you lose a mediator or you lose a conduit and somebody that the North Koreans could actually listen to? Is that possible?
Well, we've been going soft with China and Chinese violators for years or decades, and that hasn't gotten us very strong support from China. So we need to divorce law enforcement from diplomacy. We can continue to implore and beg and plead and pressure Beijing to more fully implement required UN sanctions, but we need to enforce U.S. law because the vast majority of all international financial transactions are denominated in dollars. That means they come through the U.S. financial system. We're not only allowed, but we're required to defend our financial system. So by not enforcing these secondary sanctions, we've been giving de facto immunity to Chinese criminals simply because they're Chinese. So we can, as Matt pointed out, influence the behavior of the Chinese banks and businesses that are engaging with North Korea, regardless of what the Chinese government wants them to do. We've seen in the past the Bank of China defied the government of China in 2005, 2006, when they cut off North Korea from economic engagement, and then the U.S. reversed its pressure tactics, and then the Bank of China went back to engaging with North Korea.
Everybody's trying to ask, what does the U.S. want? Does it want regime change? The U.S. Secretary of State 4 weeks ago addressed this. Let's have a little listen to what Rex Tillerson had to say. And I've got a question off the back of it because things might have changed after last night. Let's have a little listen first.
We do not seek the collapse of the regime. We do not seek an accelerated reunification of the peninsula. We do not seek an excuse to send our military north of the 38th parallel. And we're trying to convey to the North Koreans, we are not your enemy. We're not your threat, but you are presenting an unacceptable threat to us, and we have to respond.
Matthew, has that changed after last night? We do not want regime change. We are not your enemy. North Koreans lob a missile over Japan. Are we back to fire and fury now?
No, I don't think so. You know, the Trump administration completed a North Korea policy review. It was the first foreign policy review they completed. And the outcome, I think, is broadly two elements. The first is kind of a coercive diplomacy element, increasing the economic, political, military pressure on North Korea to try to force them to the negotiating table to denuclearize. But the second element is realizing that part number one is going to be hard. And so in the meantime, we need to have a serious strategy to defend ourselves, defend our allies, and God forbid, have credible military options to respond in case North Korea attacks first. So I don't think the latest round of provocations really changes that underlying strategy.
Bruce, what is the likelihood that all that fire and fury talk and the drills with the South Koreans may actually be provoking North Korea, whereas there might be a better way to go about this?
Well, as Matt pointed out, we are legally allowed to conduct military exercises. North Korea's launch, the continued existence of its nuclear and missile programs are itself a violation of numerous UN Security Council resolutions. It's in defiance of the international community. Also, North Korea does an annual winter training cycle and a summer training cycle, very large-scale exercises. So they are also engaging in military exercises. when they've talked about a freeze for a freeze, we abandon or reduce our military exercises in return for them not launching missiles or conducting nuclear tests, it's apples and oranges. They're offering something they don't legally possess. A more logical starting point would be if they were to offer reductions in their own military exercises in return for ours. Whether we would accept it or whether it's a good idea, at least it's matching like and like together. But they have not offered that. Instead, they're offering something they don't possess in order to reduce the U.S. Deterrence and defense capabilities.
The North Korean ambassador tells the UN Disarmament Forum, "My country has every reason to respond with tough countermeasures as an exercise of its right to self-defense, and the US should be fully responsible for the catastrophic consequences it will entail." Does any of that sound fair, Matt?
Well, earlier you asked Keith about whether the regime is rational, and I think there's a certain rationality of irrationality being deployed here. I think the North Koreans want everyone to think that they're crazy. It purposely kind of rock the boat to get everyone nervous as a form of deterrence. And so I think we need to, on one hand, understand that this does pose a real threat. North Korea is only the third country after Russia and China, a third adversary, I should say, to be able to hold the U.S. homeland at risk with threat of nuclear war. So it's very serious. On the other hand, I think we need to understand what the North Koreans are doing. They're doing this trying to manipulate our fears, and I think we need to also be able to see through that.
Keith Bennett in London, let me ask you, North Korea has the nuclear deterrent. Why risk collective suicide by continuing to fire missiles and by doing what it's been doing over the past few years? Nobody will touch it because it has nuclear weapons. Why risk nuclear war, Keith?
The problem is that the US administration under President Trump speaks with many voices. And the United States has threatened North Korea with nuclear attack on numerous occasions in 1950, in 1953, in 1968, in 1976, in 1994. If it's quite clear that the United States has no intention of attacking North Korea, the Pentagon could remove North Korea from its nuclear first strike list, and it could come forward with a serious proposal for negotiations.
But it works both ways, doesn't it, Keith? On a daily basis, North Korea threatens not only the United States, but South Korea and Japan and so on with nuclear annihilation. So if that's the rationale, that because the other side is threatening, then this would go on forever, right? At what point do we say, well, your actions determine where you are and what you do? Why are the North Koreans risking annihilation?
The United States has put the nuclear annihilation of North Korea on the agenda for decades now. I think that, as you know, that China and Russia have put forward a freeze-for-freeze proposal whereby North Korea would stop its nuclear and missile tests, and the United States and its allies in the region would stop their large-scale military exercises. You don't move from a state of frozen confrontation and bitter hostility that's lasted for well over half a century in one single step. You need a set of incremental steps. You need confidence-building processes. You need what's called around the world now a peace process. Unfortunately, in the fragmentary bits of the debate that I've been able to hear today, our colleague, at least one of our colleagues in Washington, appears to want to shoot down the freeze-for-freeze proposal, which, incidentally is a joint proposal of Russia and China now, formally endorsed by the two countries' foreign ministers, which rather belies Matthew's view that that the whole world is united around the idea that the only problem in the region is North Korea. It's true that Russia and China have gone along with and agreed to UN Security Council sanctions, but both of them have also said that what they call the reasonable security interests of the DPRK should be addressed. Right. And they both call for both sides not to engage in provocative actions.
Okay, so let me ask Bruce. Bruce, isn't it the responsible thing to do for President Trump not to say all options are on the table? Because by by even thinking about a military option, you're risking nuclear war. You're risking a nuclear exchange. So shouldn't the United States and its allies take that option clearly off the table because nobody wants nuclear war?
Well, there are many military options. Obviously, one of them is if North Korea invades South Korea again, a military response is on the table, as we are required to defend South Korea. If North Korea does yet another tactical or operational attack against South Korea, Japan, or U.S. forces there, we are required to respond militarily. I think it's useful also to point out that North Korea has signed 4 international agreements never to build nuclear weapons. They promised that repeatedly. They then signed 4 international agreements after that to give up the weapons they promised never to build in the first place. We've had 2-party, 3-party, 4-party, 6-party talks. We've had South Korea has 240 agreements with the North. All of those have failed to moderate North Korean behavior and induce political and economic reform. So we have been down the path of diplomacy and engagement repeatedly. U.S. officials will say they repeatedly try to engage with North Korea, and the North Korean diplomats reject engagement. So as long as North Korea continues to defy the international community, rejects returning to negotiations in a meaningful way, then we're left with trying to use pressure tactics to get it to obey international law, to obey U.S. law, to obey the international community. In the meantime, we have sufficient resources to defend ourselves and our allies against what could be yet another North Korean attack or threats, as you pointed out, on a daily basis to attack the U.S. and its allies.
Matthew, you said earlier that the North Koreans sometimes want you to think they're crazy and irrational. What's your opinion? I mean, they're an enigma to many people. In a nutshell, and I'll let this be the final point because we're running out of time, what do you think they want, Matthew? What does North Korea want?
The Kim regime wants to survive. They live pretty large while the rest of the country is suffering. I think they want to continue to rule the country. But I think they may have more expansive ambitions as well. The North Koreans and the South Koreans are technically still at war. Kim Jong-un's father and grandfather had plans for invading the South Koreans, including digging tunnels under the border to plan for an invasion. So I think one of the dangers here is if North Korea believes it can deter the United States from intervening and helping South Korea, that North Korea may think it has a free hand to use military force to reunify the peninsula, to invade the South. And so that's one of the many dangers that this nuclear capability presents to the United States and the international community.
Yeah, the one thing I got from the place was that from those who I was allowed to talk to, reunification was top of their agenda, but on their terms. And I think that's the crucial point. Gentlemen, it's been a pleasure talking to all of you. Bruce Klinger, Matthew Krunick, and Keith Bennett. I thank you very much for joining us.